I'd like to welcome all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. If you're just checking into this webinar, we welcome you. My name is Dr. John Hemmings. I am the Senior Director for the Indo-Pacific program here at the Pacific Forum, and I will be hosting this event. We have a very, very exciting webinar that has been sort of germinating over many, many months and has come out at a very timely occasion. The U.S.-Philippine Alliance and a Free and Open Indo-Pacific. I'm very grateful, as is the entire Pacific Forum, to the U.S. Embassy in Manila for sponsoring us. And we have got a great panel for you today. We're not going to just focus on recent events in the South China Sea and the St. Thomas Shoal. However, I'm pretty sure all of you will bring us back to that in the Q&A. We are excited that a number of sort of pertinent issues in the news today make this extremely timely, as one of our experts has already noted that a resupply mission is taking place at this very moment. We have a superb group of individuals who I'm going to introduce shortly. But before I do, I'd like to just quickly run through some of the rules of the road for today. We are on the record for today. I know some of you will be journalists. Just to give you a sense of our wonderful presenters, I'm going to go through them by name. And I'll ask the presenters to turn on their camera as I name them. And then after I finish naming them, and introducing them, to turn those cameras off, but so that you can get a sense of who they are. So Dr. Renato Cruz de Castro, he is going to be presenting first. He's a distinguished professor at the Department of International Studies in De La Salle University, Manila. He's also, like myself, an alumni of DKI APCSS, Department of Defense Regional Center here in Hawaii, which runs courses on Indo-Pacific security. He's written over 100 articles on international relations and security, and has edited works in the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, Canada, Malaysia, France, the US, the Netherlands. And he also has, like many of our panelists today, a link to the United States South. So with that, I'm going to call him by his first name, Renato. Would you just turn on your camera briefly, wave at everybody before I introduce our next person, and then we'll come back to you for your opening 5-minute remarks. So thank you for that. Next, I'll introduce very quickly Dr. Christa Wiegand. She is the director of the Center for National Security and Foreign Affairs at Howard Baker School and professor of political science at University of Tennessee. You're beginning to notice we do have a Southern trend here today. She specializes in international conflict and political violence and has written 3 books, edited a number of others. And so with that, Christa, thank you for joining us. Next, Dr. Aris Arugay. He's professor and chairperson at the Department of Political Science at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. His research interests are civil-military relations, comparative democratization, security sector reform, and international relations of Southeast Asia. He's also an editor-in-chief of Asian Politics and Policy, an academic journal. So with that, I will now introduce our last but not least, Ray Powell. So Ray Powell is director of CLIGHT at the Gordian Knot Center of National Security Innovation at Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. He's just recently concluded a 35-year career in the United States Air Force, served multiple tours of the Philippines, Hawaii, Vietnam. Very impressive, achieving colonel rank in that time. And so with that, I will scroll all the way back to the top. So Renato, sir, the floor is yours, and you have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Since the organizers are based in Hawaii, I'll use the term aloha to everyone. So my presentation for today is based on a couple of articles that I have written. That's looking at, of course, the alliance in the larger context of what I call the Philippine grand strategy in the 21st century. So everyone seems to be kind of taken aback by the dramatic improvement of Philippine-U.S. alliance ever since last year. Well, people attributed generally, of course, to the fact that we have a new President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who seems to be more predisposed to the alliance than, of course, his predecessor. but actually the efforts to bring about the, first of all, maintenance, and later on, I would use the term the revival of the alliance, actually began even during a time of President Rodrigo Duterte. In about, at the onset of Rodrigo Duterte's term, he implied that he would like to distance the Philippines away from the United States and gravitate closer to China. Well, of course, after 4 years, he realized that this was, of course, a case of a pie in the sky. You have basically three factors that prevented the Philippines under the Duterte administration from, of course, diminishing the alliance between the United States and the Philippines, and of course, gravitating closer to China. First of all, is the fact that China did not deliver the money that was promised to former President Duterte when he was in Beijing in October 2016. China is supposed to have promised about $24 billion. Less than about 600 million actually entered the Philippine economy and, of course, used in two major infrastructure projects. And, of course, a significant factor there was the fact that China continued its coercive operations or gray zone operations against units of the Armed Forces of the Philippines and, of course, in the Spratlys. Now, going into, of course, what happened last year, the original goal of President Marcos was to seek a balanced policy vis-a-vis the United States and China. Hopefully, he could get economic resources from China in terms of trade, public investment, trade concessions, but at the same time, something that he had learned in terms of dealing with China, no amount of economic interdependence with China would prevent China from pursuing its expansionist and coercive operations in the South China Sea. So at the end, of course, he realized that, you have three major cases of Chinese gray zone operations, which forced President Marcos Jr. to gravitate closer to the alliance. And of course, what happened, of course, is balanced policy is a case that he realized that he could not simply seek the balance, given the fact that China's is simply could not offer any substantive concession, especially when it comes to the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea issue. So what are basically the elements of this revitalized alliance? I'll just breeze through it. Later on, we could discuss it and, of course, discuss implication. Number one, of course, was the implementation and to a certain degree, the expansion of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement of 2014. In 2016, after, of course, a major case in the Supreme Court, during the time, the outgoing Aquino administration agreed to open 5 sites for use of the armed forces of course, use of the U.S. Armed Forces. But of course, the implementation was delayed during the Duterte administration. Now, of course, since last year, they have the decision to implement them and, of course, expand the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement by opening 4 AFP bases located, 3 of them located in northern Luzon. 1, of course, is located along Palawan. The second element, of course, is the large-scale Balikatan exercise, which, of course, happened this year. You have about 17,000 Filipino, American, and Australian forces conducting conventional military exercises. The third one, of course, is the new defense guidelines, which, of course, provides for a clear guarantee in terms of the Mutual Defense Treaty and, of course, putting a roadmap for the cooperation between the United States and the Philippine Armed Forces in terms of modernizing the Armed Forces of the Philippines. And finally, is, of course, linking the Philippine-U.S. alliance with other U.S. alliances. So those are the 4 elements of what we considered as the revitalized Philippine-U.S. alliance in the 21st century. But of course, you have a number of challenges. Definitely, China has been watching the developments that's happening here. And my argument in my paper is it's like just going back to the Aquino administration, wherein the Philippines has adopted a hard balancing strategy vis-a-vis China. Of course, the alliance will encounter a lot of challenges. This is something maybe we could discuss in the Q&A. I'll end my presentation for now, and I look forward to a vibrant discussion later in the Q&A. Thank you very much for your attention.
Sorry about that, everyone. Some mute issues. That was lovely. Thank you so much, Renato. Christa, your 5 minutes begins now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me to the panel. So I'm going to follow up with what Renato has discussed about the alliance from the perspective of both the U.S. side and, of course, the Philippine side. This is a really great moment in time for the alliance because there's a very strong commitment from the U.S. side and there's a very strong commitment from the Philippine side. So these two things have to happen in any alliance, any strong alliance relationship. And this is truly actually happening right now, as we all know. This is really important, particularly with regard to the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea. The alliance is showing signs of shifting toward the same way that other U.S. alliances in the region are going, South Korea, Australia, and Japan in particular. And that is more of a networked model rather than a hub and spoke model. So that's also a very good sign. And I think there are several policy positions and also recent activities that have been going on in the alliance, and both by the Philippine side and the U.S. that really indicate this shifting movement and revitalization, as Renato mentioned. Of course, he's mentioned a few of them already. I'll also just mention the number of meetings between the U.S. And the U.S. government, particularly, of course, the presidential visits. Those are very significant, very symbolic. The vice presidential visit in the Philippines, and of course the 2+2 meetings that have been going on with and the foreign affairs and defense secretaries. Those are all very important meetings. I think by far the most important on the U.S. side is this very clear, very unambiguous commitment to defend the Philippine armed forces, Coast Guard vessels, public vessels, and aircraft in the region, specifically, of course, citing Philippine activity in the West Philippine Sea, and I think, or the South China Sea for the U.S. This has really been demonstrated by actual U.S. responses, especially to recent incidents in the South China Sea. So this is not just rhetoric. I think there's a real sense of true commitment and this demonstrated commitment by the U.S. Of course, the large military exercises and working toward greater cooperation, interoperability, that's also very important, particularly in the maritime domain. This is a very important aspect, of course, of the cooperation, notably, of course, in the South China Sea. And of course, more specifically in the maritime area, the resuming of joint patrols. By far, this is a very, again, very tangible signal of the strengthening of the alliance and much more commitment by the U.S. in that region. And of course, the new defense guidelines in support of modernization. Now, the policy choices by the Marcos administration to pursue closer security cooperation with the U.S., these have several consequences. And I think that the Philippine position really sends a clear signal to China and other countries in the region about its position, of course, regarding its defense of the West Philippine Sea. They already had the arbitration, of course, in 2016, but recent actions and continuous rhetoric and actions are really send very strong signals, not just to China, but other countries. And of course, the joint patrols and clear U.S. policy about defending the Philippines may hopefully deter China from taking some of its more aggressive actions that it's taken in the past. We'll see, of course, with recent events. The Philippine position also really challenges claims by China that the U.S. is weakening in strength and influence in the Indo-Pacific region. I think there's been a lot of emphasis in recent years on how much inroads China has made in Southeast Asia and ASEAN countries in particular. And I think the Philippines does a good job standing out and showing that this is not really true. The Philippines is really taking a leading role in taking a position, a very clear position, very different than the other ASEAN countries, which have taken more cautious strategies than these other countries. The last thing I'll mention is, of course, that both governments are very aware that it is a risky strategy to stand up to China and not hedge quite as much as some of the other countries are doing. And so there is always a risky position here, particularly, for example, if there's a conflict between China and Taiwan, where does the Philippines stand in that position? And that's something that's going to be very tricky for both governments in the years to come, but hopefully we won't have to deal with that. With that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Christa. I'm very interested to see Taiwan has already been introduced into the equation, as has some of the risks and balancing. Very interesting. With that, Aris, the floor is yours, sir.
Morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. It's a pleasure to join this distinguished panel. I'll keep my remarks, preliminary remarks, into three, and maybe complement the input so far by also having a perspective on the Philippine domestic side. President Marcos indeed has actually concretized a lot of the foreign policy and security policy thrust with the recent approval and dissemination of his government's national security policy. This is the third public national security policy by the Philippine government that started with the Benigno II administration, Aquino administration, then the Duterte administration, and now the Marcos Jr. administration. Well, there are clear lines and parallelisms between the national security policies of these three presidential administrations. What we can observe from the Marcos Jr. administration's NSP is that there's a clear, again, reorientation on the emphasis for external challenges and territorial defense. And Marcos's embrace of the United States and its seeming support towards strengthening the Philippine alliance is also pretty much influenced by the anxiety and the worrying state of the regional strategic environment, particularly in Southeast Asia and in the Indo-Pacific region, with multiple regional flashpoints, not to mention just the South China Sea, but also the Taiwan contingency and even North Korea. So in a way, the Marcos Jr. administration has not focused so much on domestic security issues, unlike his predecessor, and has now put forward, in fact, a gentle reminder to the military that its mandate is definitely territorial defense or external defense. And in a way, this has been what the military has been trying to reorient itself in this day and age, and given the 21st century security challenges that the Philippines face. On the domestic side, however, you can see that while the president, we often call him Philippine president, the chief architect of Philippine foreign policy, gray zone tactics and influence operations by countries like China has also muddled the ability of the Philippine government to be united behind the thrust of the new administration. Let us remember that in Philippine politics and foreign policy, politics rarely stops at the water's edge. This means that there are possible veto players, there are possible domestic factors to consider in the sustainability of these foreign policy directions. In our own study of alignment choices of the Philippines so far, two factors are critical. One is that the ability of the president and his regime or government to be able to sustain legitimation in any situation where this legitimation is challenged, then the president could make different foreign policy alignments. The second has something to do with the onset of foreign policy or security policy crises, wherein the president is challenged or put into a test. However, despite Chinese influence operations in the Philippines, there is some pushback on bureaucratic institutions to support the current thrust of the government, particularly the revitalization of the alliance with the United States. But let us see what happens in the succeeding months and years, because we can also talk about the U.S. domestic side, and sustainability and the credibility of the commitment of the United States also has to consider what happens domestically in the United States as well. Finally, I could say that on the Philippine side, this sustainability of foreign policy directions has also something to do with the internal politics that happens in the Philippines, particularly the sustainability of the Marcos Duterte coalition and what happens in the midterm elections in 2025. And as you may know, certain institutions in the Philippines, including the Senate, could somehow also have a profound influence on foreign and security policy directions of the country. I think I'll stop there, and I look forward to the Q&A section of this webinar.
And perfectly on time at that, Aris. Thank you so much. Ray, you're up. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, and good evening from California. I just returned from a long trip to the Philippines, which was partially a vacation, but also punctuated by some interesting events in the life of Sealight. First, we launched our website, sealight.live, at the 7th anniversary celebration of the arbitral tribunal victory of the Philippines over China in 2016. So launching the website was very exciting for us, because that's where we are trying to bring as much light into the maritime gray zone of the South China Sea as possible. And so we were excited to be able to do that. While I was there, of course, there was the most recent incident around Second Thomas Shoal, or Ayungin Shoal, with the water cannon incident. And so that took up a lot of my time near the end. And a couple of things really came out of that I'd like to zone in on. As John mentioned, there is actually a resupply mission happening right now. And the reason this resupply mission was required was because of the water cannon took out some of the supplies that were supposed to have gone to Ayungin Shoal, or the BRP Sierra Madre. So here's one of the points I've been making pretty routinely since that happened. First, we need to start calling this what it is. This is a blockade. So China is executing a peacetime blockade of a neighboring country's outpost. They will say, well, we allow through food and medicine and replacement personnel. I'm sorry, that is still a blockade, because you are telling the Philippines that they cannot repair their own outpost. This is important because, first, we need to be outraged about that. It is not okay for countries to blockade other countries' outposts. In fact, in some more law of war type discussions, people talk about blockades as being an act of war. And these are scary terms, but we need to sort of call it what it is. Calling it what it is doesn't mean we have to show up with an aircraft carrier tomorrow. What it means is we should be outraged. Secondly, we should recognize this is part of a strategy by China to isolate the Sierra Madre until it breaks up, and that day may be coming very soon. And when that day happens, what will happen next? Almost certainly, China will have the preponderance of forces in the area. They may swoop in to rescue the Philippine sailors who are there aboard the Sierra Madre, and then that will be the end of the Philippine outpost at Ayungin Shoal. And what will the Philippines do? What will the United States, as the Philippines ally, do at that point? We need to be talking about that. So thirdly, we need to be talking about what is the Philippines' counter-blockade strategy. If you're going to get around a blockade, eventually you have to decide, are you going to try to break it, circumvent it, get it lifted? So what is your strategy to actually get that blockade ended? Because China's strategy is very clear. It intends to continue the blockade until the end of the Sierra Madre. And again, I think that may be happening very soon. Finally, I'm going to say that it's not like the Philippines hasn't been doing anything. This year, one of the most noteworthy things the Philippines has done is this transparency policy, which has been absolutely necessary, though not sufficient. but clearly it has been necessary. It has highlighted the maritime sovereignty problem. It is a new approach based on using public information in the Philippines' favor, because that is an advantage the Philippines has. And we've seen a rise in national resiliency and sort of the willingness of the Philippine people to stand up. We've seen a definite rise in international support, which is crucial, clarification of the U.S. position, which is crucial. Now, what we don't know is to what extent all of this is going to deter China from carrying out this gray zone strategy against the Philippines. The Philippines is very unique in the South China Sea. People like to say, well, all the China's neighbors have issues with the 9-dash line. That's true, but only the Philippines has an active military base with a port and an airfield in their EEZ, in their exclusive economic zone. That's Mischief Reef. And that reef is only 30 kilometers from the other thing that's very unique, which is only the Philippines faces a blockade of one of its outposts. China essentially chose the most vulnerable outpost in the South China Sea, the one that's on the Rusty Ship, and has decided to execute this blockade until the ship succumbs to the elements. So that's us. We're from Sea Light. Sealight.live is the website. We invite you to check it out. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you so much for the entire panel. I'll ask you now to all of you switch on cameras and microphones. And if you have any issues with that, my colleagues will help you. It struck me as a perfectly pitched panel, and I really have to thank Jeffrey or Daniel, Dr. Ordaniel, for this, because we very much started with the overview of the alliance from Renato's perspective. Renato, to some extent, I might start the questioning with you. We'll give maybe two questions. One for yourself and another. I come from a background of studying Japan. I work on the U.S.-Japan alliance a lot. What seemed to happen recently with the Philippines, the United States, some years ago, nearly 10 years ago with Japan, when the Senkaku Islands issue was flaring up, which is really work on the defense guidelines, put things in place. I remember the 2015 defense guidelines sort of replicate the most recent guidelines with the US and Philippines. And B was give that sort of ironclad commitment to sort of get rid of the gray zone. It hasn't seen the end of the Senkaku Island issue, but certainly it has to some extent control it. Why do you think it took a little bit longer with the US and Philippines to get to that space? Was it the US, the Philippines, a bit of both, and
the guidelines, the defense guidelines?
Yeah, and broadly that sort of.
Well, of course, number one is the 6 years of the Duterte administration. That could have been possible if the Duterte administration did not happen, but of course it happened. And there was really a conscious effort on the part of the Duterte administration to win the Philippines away from the United States. But fortunately or unfortunately, you have a number of developments that favor the alliance. Number one, you have the election of Donald Trump, which gave Rodrigo Duterte a sort of a benefit of the doubt. And of course, they developed very close relationship between him and President Duterte. Then, of course, what happened in May 2017, the Marawi siege crisis, which of course made President Duterte realize that he could not simply drop the alliance like a hot potato. The military basically told him, look at what the United States has been doing, providing us assistance. China, of course, provided weapons during the siege, but one of my students in the National Defense College that did a thesis on that matter, he said the weapons until now given by China are not yet used. They're still in the stockade of Philippine National Police. So that's a factor there. In the last 6 years of the Duterte administration, let's have to thank God the military, the Philippine public basically drew the line. The alliance is important to us, but nevertheless, it damaged the alliance. The alliance simply exists in terms of the bureaucratic inertia, but there was simply no political direction. The political direction only happened this year under, of course, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. But as Aris mentioned out, there are still challenges happening. So, of course, you also have to take into account the asymmetry in the alliance. There's a wide gap between the U.S.-Japan security relation and the Philippine-U.S. alliance. And until, of course, recently, the Philippine-U.S. alliance has been focused primarily on counterterrorism. You have an efforts to change it during the Aquino administration, but again, the Duterte administration happened. So the Philippines is simply, the alliance is simply catching up in terms of the, the progress made in terms of, the U.S.-Japan security relations. So that's my answer regarding your question.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being the first to take the bullet, as you were the first on the firing line for this. All right, ladies and gentlemen at home, you have two ways of interacting with our wonderful panelists. You can raise your hand if you want to kind of go live and ask a question, or you can type into the chat feature. And I see one person has already come up. So on the chat feature and written out a question. If I could also ask you to decide which of the panelists you'd like to ask. This one, I think, speaks a little bit to Christa's comments. So I'm going to ask Christa to touch upon the remarks made by Professor Renato. The spirit of the Camp David statement had a lot of commentary on institutionalizing stronger ties between the nations involved, and what's being done to institutionalize the current relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines, especially public ties. That's by Albert Lee. And I think you mentioned the networked model and the sort of that general space. And I might add a little bit of that to myself, which is, can you see, for example, I think the U.S.-Japan-South Korea relationship became almost regional facing at Camp David, whereas previously been only focused on the peninsula. Can you see something happening akin to that in this institutionalization that Mr. Lee's asked about?
Yes, absolutely. I think, Renato mentioned already the fact that the Philippines is not just this bilateral U.S. relationship. It really is now becoming a player in the network of the U.S. alliance. So it's not just U.S. Philippines, it's also Australia Philippines, Japan Philippines. And I think that's really critical to indicate it's not just the U.S. dominating everything in these very bilateral, one direction, asymmetrical relationships. The Philippines can carry its own weight. And I think Australia and Japan in particular recognize that. South Korea to a lesser degree, but they're getting there. And so I think that's a very important aspect. So these countries have been operating separate from the U.S. They're all, of course, U.S. allies, but that's a really important step that they're taking, that in this way, China can't turn to these countries and say, the U.S. is just telling you what to do, because in this case, the U.S. is not. Actually, these countries are taking agency. They're making their decisions to network among themselves within the region without an outside partner telling them what to do. So I think those are very important things. I think also just all of these countries are recognizing, or these allies are recognizing, just how aggressive, as Ray mentioned, China's been aggressive for many years, but the rhetoric continues to be very aggressive, of course, mostly about Taiwan, but it continues to be with the South China Sea as well. And there are countries outside of the South China Sea, like Australia, who are very much concerned about this. They understand the ramifications for Australia, even though they're not even in the South China Sea, right? So they're willing to help the Philippines in that regard. And I think that this is all a really good signal of what's to come.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm going to try someone who has their hand up. James Lee, if you're on, would you turn on your camera and your mic? We're going to unmute you. And if you just quickly ask your question, that would be wonderful if you can keep it relatively brief. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Can you guys hear me?
We hear you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So Dr. Renato, he started by mentioning the Philippine grand strategy. So I'm just wondering, what exactly is a Philippine grand strategy? Nobody has really taken the time to explain what the grand strategy is. And the same question is with the remarks from Ray Powell. I believe, if my memory is correct, like in the case of the Japan-China conflict over Senkaku Islands, it seemed that the U.S. was actually willing to send a signal that that if China were to take over Senkaku, Senkaku is actually part of Japan. Therefore, the U.S.-Japan alliance would come into play, and U.S. would be willing to go to war against China to defend Senkaku. But in the case of the Philippine outpost in the South China Sea, I mean, if China would take over the Philippine outpost, is that outpost considered to be actually part of the Philippines? And will U.S. be actually willing to go to war against China to defend the outpost?
Great, thank you so much for that. So we got two questions, really, one for Renato and one for Ray.
In terms of the strategy, I use the term hard balancing. You know, Philippine grand strategy now is in a way similar to the grand strategy during the time of the Aquino administration, which is, of course, directly challenging China. And there are three components to this. Number one, of course, is the fact that you have the buildup of the armed forces of the Philippines, which actually began during the Aquino administration. And of course, with the Marcos administration, you have more money being injected in terms of the modernization program. In every instance, when you have President Marcos delivering a talk to the armed forces of the Philippines, he would emphasize, and this was mentioned by Aris, it's high time to focus on the external. You know, this was as part of his speech that he delivered last February in the Western Command. For so many years, for so many decades, our maritime borders had been sacrosanct. Now you have a great power that's basically undermining our border. And I'm asking the armed forces of the Philippines to direct their attention externally. So even in terms of the rhetoric, and even in terms of putting his money where his mouth is, you see it really hell-bent on directly challenging China, although he has not come out in terms of actual articulation, but just have to look at the actions. The expansion of the EDCA sites. And of course, we all know for a fact that especially those 3 additional EDCA sites in northern Luzon are not there simply for humanitarian assistance and risk reduction. We know what are the purpose of those facilities. They're only a couple of 100 miles away from, of course, Taiwan. They're basically pointed towards Taiwan. You know, the governor of Cagayan saw this, and of course, he was very close to the Chinese. Then what's the other question regarding the islands? Of course, you...
So
okay.
Why don't we, Ray, so we can move on, because I do want to get who hasn't asked a question, but thank you. Ray, do you want to have a plug at the island one quickly?
Sure. Yeah. So actually the United States has become much clearer in particularly this year, in enunciating its willingness to abide by the terms of the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty with the Philippines, and has included in that discussion Philippine outposts and vessels in the South China Sea as being all part of that equation. So that those kinds of terms have already been sort of laid down. That is why China is not directly thus far going after the Sierra Madre, which is still considered to be an active duty naval vessel, even though, of course, it wouldn't float. And so now I think it's very important to say that just because there's a mutual defense treaty, I think it's a little, we don't want to be too sloppy and say, are you willing to go to war? Well, I mean, that is, maybe sort of the most extreme end of a mutual defense treaty. But just because you invoke the treaty and enter into consultations, for example, that doesn't mean we're going to, we're going to start shooting. There are many, many steps between peace and war, and we are a long time from the days when nations would have declarations of war and those kinds of things. So I think that the treaty is very useful in this regard. It does sort of remind China, especially as a deterrent. But I don't think that invoking the treaty, we should necessarily conclude that there's going to be a war.
Great, and we have I think a very suitable question for Arias. Notwithstanding the rebalancing of the Philippines-U.S. relationship under Marcos, could you expand on the extent of the vulnerability to the alliance, given China's ability to continue to influence Philippine domestic policy, be it Belt and Road, public opinion, and in the context of China's deepening military assertiveness in the South China Sea? And that's from Simon Gray.
Right. What we have observed is the relentless approach of China to be able to influence a lot of institutions and sectors in and out of government, including Rene is familiar with this, including the academia in the Philippines. And if you're familiar with what China has done in a lot of countries, this is something that is quite common in Australia as well, and other Southeast Asian countries. And it's quite easy for some of these influenced individuals or institutions to embrace, because China offers a lot of incentives. But I do think that in terms of the vulnerability, what is important is that the government remains cohesive on strategy and on policy, and that it is able to, this is what I observed from Marcos, that it is able to ensure compliance and control of its own bureaucracy, for example. While you may have opinion columnists, academics who may toe the Chinese line, it is also important to call them out. It's also important for media to rely on credible and reputable sources of information, and not just quote anyone who's a pundit or who's an influencer or who's a self-proclaimed expert just because they offer the alternative view to what is the mainstream view as far as Philippine strategic issues are concerned.
Okay, excellent. We have one hand up. I believe it's from Donald Kirk, who I believe is a journalist. Mr. Kirk, if you are able to come up, would you ask the question? And
right, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. And would you
Okay.
tell us, unless you'd like the question to be answered by?
Well, I don't know. You can decide. But my question was, and I also put it in writing. I wasn't sure which would be more convenient. My question was, how can we expect the Philippine Armed Forces to operate effectively when they're still shot through with corruption, massive corruption, which you've been hearing about for years, and also when they're actually relatively small. It's a small military establishment for a country of more than 100 million people, and they're still tied down in dealing with revolt by the communist guerrillas and by Muslim factions. Now, I realize that some of these revolts have tapered off. Maybe they're not as severe now as they were, but they're still existing. It's a lot to deal with. It's basically, Armed Forces of the Philippines is an internal peacekeeping force, not really prepared to deal with a massive foreign power. So if you could address this issue, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
The rest of your question, I'll throw that open to the panel. It's quite a shot across the bow. Anyone eager to take a bite at that?
Rene, do you want the first stab, and then I'll well, as someone who's been studying the military for quite some time, the observations still hold water, but the military has prided itself of undergoing modernization for quite a number of years. And for Rene and myself, who's been studying the military for quite some time, we also notice the change. It has something to do with generational change. It has something to do with a lot of the military officials being able to see what a modern armed forces look like when they're deployed for training abroad. And in fact, one critical element of modernization is the role of the United States in ensuring that there would be defense reform, that military doctrine is updated. But you are correct. There is still some inertia as far as the thinking is concerned. We may even see this, for example, with the pushback of the military as far as pension reform is concerned, which is very important. You might think like, why is pensions of the military and uniformed personnel important? But it is draining not only the defense budget, but the entire fiscal budget of the government. Now, I have been criticized by the military itself for having a strong position on reforming the pensions, but I do think that this is where civilian oversight and civilian control is very important. The reappointment of Gilbert Teodoro as Defense Secretary, for me, it's a step in the right direction because he is a civilian appointee with no formal military background, and while he's a reservist. But at the same time, we see that it's also important that controlling the military by democratic civilian institutions, I think, is the key to ensuring that it becomes a modern armed forces capable of responding to security challenges.
Renato?
Well, I tend to agree there's corruption in the military, but there's been efforts to manage it ever since, of course, you have the Aquino administration. There's also an effort to win it away slowly from internal security to external defense. And of course, it does not intend to engage China, the People's Liberation Army or Navy head on. It basically is planning for an asymmetric warfare. And of course, there's no way that we could engage China head on. That's why we have the alliance, right? So you have, of course, the Mutual Defense Board basically discussing how the Philippines and the United States Armed Forces will have to coordinate their actions, just in case if push comes to shove, not only, of course, in the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea. The greater challenge, in fact, which the armed forces is already, in a way, already imagining the scenario would be, of course, a major armed confrontation across the Luzon Strait, and that is, of course, Taiwan.
Okay, I think we had a shot across the Philippine bow. We now have a shot across the U.S. bow from both of our U.S. panelists. In addition to Duterte's sort of, he didn't like the United States, scholars do point out the fact that the U.S. failure to aid the Philippines during the 2012 Scarborough standoff, and the fact that the Trump administration was notorious for sort of withdrawing from that global police role that limits U.S. engagement. Given all that, to what extent does the United States need to really, how can it show its sincerity or, show that it really is a solid commitment to the Philippines, coming from a Philippine perspective? Why don't we start with Christa and then we'll go to Ray.
So I think we're in a very, very different place than we were in 2012. It's amazing just what 10 or 11 years can do. And of course, where the U.S. relationship with China is in a very, very different place from that time also. So I think that, the whole geostrategic balance of everything has changed just in 10 or 11 years. So first of all, time, it seems like forever ago. And it's unimaginable now that Scarborough Shoals would happen. Of course, it's hard to know with hindsight 2020. But I don't think that will happen now. The U.S. is already showing great commitment. I know it's very difficult, especially with past evidence of not being committed or not standing up for an ally necessarily. The Obama administration was criticized heavily for that. It's very easy to wonder, well, are they really going to follow through this time? And that's a really hard decision to make for the U.S. government, particularly. I think that there's something important, that's important to note about the difference. People often forget that, there's a difference between the Coast Guard and the Navy. The Coast Guard is doing law enforcement and dealing with, Ray talked about a blockade. It's not, there's a difference between, the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Coast Guard and the Philippine Coast Guard and the Navy. And that gets really messy if you're starting to just, if you bring in the hard guns and you bring in the Navy and these, destroyers and stuff to help supply, you're changing the scenario here. If you're talking about Coast Guard vessels with joint patrol, that's a different scenario. You're not likely to get a lot of pushback, hopefully, from the Chinese Navy, for example, or even in gray zone tactics. All of these things, there are so many potential scenarios and different directions this could go. But I think the good news is the U.S. is signaling the right, they're sending the right signals. They're committed and they will be there. Again, no guarantees that China will not push back and we won't get into a conflict. But I agree with Ray that this is not the only option is not war. There are many, many steps before there.
Great. Ray?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I just want to build on what Christa said, which I think was really apt. One is that while it is absolutely the case that in democratic societies and open societies like ours that care about that civil-military divide, we really run into a hard situation when it comes to dealing with China, which has decided to blur all of that. And so we have China Coast Guard ships and even the maritime militia involved in what we would consider traditional military operations like a blockade. So that makes things very difficult because we, of course, are still in our stovepipes for good reason. You know, we don't want the military involved in civil operations, and yet we are faced with a competitor that sees those things very differently and uses the blurring of those lines to its advantage. It knows that we react differently to a Coast Guard ship than a Navy ship, but when it uses the Coast Guard ship in a naval fashion, we have to actually take that into account. The other thing is I really appreciate Christa's historical perspective. Really from 2012 maybe through 2016, we were really going through I think a period where we're trying to readjust our understanding of what China was and would become, and it was the hard death of the responsible stakeholder theory that suggested that eventually we could sort of woo China into the rules-based order that we liked. And we were still trying to do that at that time. We thought that there was a way through, and we were frankly fooling ourselves. And that's in part why we sort of allowed all of that to happen. And for all of his interesting faults and other things, the one thing that Donald Trump did do and his administration, I will say, was to bring in a lot of clarity. And the national security strategy and the national defense strategy that the Trump administration was that put into place was a very hard turn away from that period of sort of rose-colored glasses into a much more realistic assessment of who China was. So I agree with Christa 100%. We are in a far different place now than we were then.
Okay, I have two questions from people written in the chat, which I'm going to sort of combine. You'll see why they sort of complement each other. We have Edgar Pune says, the news today that the resupply to the Yungan Shoal failed again. So we've just dropped in the chat box a CNN article about an hour old reinforcing that narrative. So here's the question: Is there any reason the Philippines has not asked for U.S. Coast Guard / U.S. Hope to facilitate the resupply? And if you'll hold fire, all my panelists, there's a great connective tissue question from Christopher Woody that says the U.S., Japan, and Australia are planning a joint patrol in the South China Sea off the Western Philippines this week, but the Philippines is not taking part. Is there a space, so, and his question is that, are they deliberately not taking part on purpose? And then I suppose, so the question to any of you teasing out of that is there more that the U.S. can do in terms of resupply? And frankly, is there more the Philippines can do? I mean, I think in that last question, there's sort of a question about, and we've seen this in some great analysis over this week on whether the Philippines wants to use, more politicization of the issue within ASEAN, et cetera, or does it want to use more physical tools? And so with that, I'm going to put those two questions to the panel. We just had the Americans, so if one of I
just want to, John, I'm sorry, because I feel like I need to speak up about this article because it quotes me as being the source. So I did not say in any way, and I don't think it's in the article, that the mission failed. And I don't think we know how the mission went yet, and we can't tell that by dots on a map. What I said was that the blockade was still in effect, and what I tend to do is when I talk about if they were just trying to get the resupply boats through, that may have happened. That we haven't had any indication one way or another. So I don't want to be misconstrued as saying that the mission failed.
Not to worry. I noted also that you were quoted in that, and I don't think it actually quotes you as saying that you were the source for that view. But well spotted. Aris or Renato, did you have Renato?
Okay. Let me answer why at this point in time the Philippines refused to basically, approach the United States in the terms of the resupply mission. In a way, it's still reacting to this Chinese narrative. In a way, this is a reflection of how the Chinese disrespect us. The Chinese always think that all our actions are formulated in Washington, D.C. When the arbitral ruling was commemorated last, Ray, you were here in Manila. The Chinese ambassador in Manila told us it's the United States has basically told the Philippines to file that case, which of course is a case of absolute fault. It's not true. It was a decision made. In fact, the United States and even the ASEAN countries were never informed. But this is a Chinese narrative, always trying to project us as simply a lucky or running dogs of the Americans. So, we have to do these certain actions. Like, for example, in Ayungin Shoal, I could still remember this when it happened in 2015. Yeah, during the time of Ambassador Goldberg, I was with the National Security Council. The first time that happened, Admiral Brian Harris offered to deliver those supplies to Ayungin Shoal on the basis of humanitarian consideration. But of course, again, this will, China's narrative would again be played out. We're simply, being used by the Americans. We have simply no basic independent existence. We're just simply dependent on the United States. So in certain cases, we have to impress on the Chinese, we have to impress on the Filipino people that we're doing it for the sake of our national interests. The United States not involved. Alliance in a way is convenient, but we cannot simply often rely on the alliance. If it's necessary, if China would use force, probably that's the time that we have to think and invoking. But if we're given a chance, we will do it in our own, because again, it's a matter of self-respect. We have to basically address this Chinese fake news that everything that we do is, of course, formulated and planned in Washington, D.C. So that's my straight answer to this. Aris, you want to add more?
Well, if there's a perception that the Philippines is not yet into or not into deep yet into confronting or challenging China, there are several factors to that. So, for example, a few weeks ago, the Senate wanted some senators wanted a strong statement on the arbitral ruling, but some senators have said that, oh, that's not the way to go. We don't want to displease China. So while the Marcos administration still, I think the policy position now is that, unlike before, is that we really don't care much about how China will react to any of the country's foreign policy decisions. There are still vestiges of that. There are still remnants of that, because some Filipino political leaders still believe that anything that somehow would assert our own rights is construed to be provoking Chinese aggression. And the rhetoric that has been used by the former president of the country is that this will invite conflict, this will make us all unsafe, this will cause Filipino lives, and such is a dangerous argument to make when the entire point is to simply assert what is ours under international law.
May I just quickly, as a moderator, say, having watched the UK debate on whether they should send a ship through the South China Sea and watching the South Korean debate on their Indo-Pacific strategy, those 2 points, those 2 messages that the Chinese give, one is don't provoke a backlash from China, and 2, you're the running dogs of the Americans. They use them for every ally. Every ally gets that message. So really fascinating that both of you elucidated that. For Christa and Ray, did you want to try any of those? The question was sort of also pointed to the U.S. Should the U.S. do more in terms of, given that we are, very close by with U.S. Japan, is being there enough, do you think? Or do you think there should be a more formal approach towards, escort duty?
I mean, this is a tipping point, I think. I mean, China does this, with the water cannons and the lasers and, but as Ray said, if this is a blockade, this is a decision point, and so the U.S. has to make a decision, and you can't go back once you go. So I don't know, I'll turn it over to Ray for further thing, but I do think it's a tipping point.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the key here is that it has to be done together, right? So it's an alliance there. It's not just about the U.S. doing more; it's about the U.S. and the Philippines agreeing on what is to be done, right? If the U.S. shows up and says, "Okay, we're ready to do more," the Philippines might be like, "Hey, that's not what we had in mind." So those are the discussions I think that could happen. And by the way, when we go back to talking about invoking the treaty, I think it's perfectly fine to invoke the treaty. Say, look, we have an active blockade happening against our outpost. We are invoking the treaty and asking for consultations. I think that would send a very strong message to China. And I think that would act as a very good deterrent because it would sort of give China the idea that maybe we are in a little deeper than we plan to be.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to go back to a question that was a little higher, that was not related to the current South China Sea issue, but more a broader issue in terms of what was just raised in this last question by our two answers on narratives and the narrative war. And I think that's really good. Guillen Lebot has asked, it looks like China is now aggressively fighting back on the information front, trying to undermine the Philippine position through quote unquote pundits. How can the government and other institutions, including the alliance, counter this information barrage, both formally and informally in cyberspace? Aris, I can see you smiling. Your opening remarks did mention the disinformation thing, so we'll hand that to you first, and then anyone else who wants to take a bite at it.
Right. Unfortunately, unlike other countries, the Philippines doesn't have any law that somehow addresses the threat of influence operations by foreign agents. Unlike, I think, Australia and other countries have imposed these new laws. And unfortunately, also, we don't see congressional hearings in aid of legislation on this matter. Some senators were very much interested on the expanded EDCA, that there were Senate investigations, but there are no Senate investigations on Chinese influence operations thus far in the Philippines. So you see the double standard there, that there are some Filipino political elites who are double downing on supposed American intrusion into domestic affairs. But what's good for the goose should be good for the gander. I mean, if we really want to protect Philippine national interest against all external undue interference, then this is a matter that must be picked up by some opposition. But you know that the opposition in the Philippines is so overwhelmed with a supermajority in both houses of Congress. But I do think that because some of these agents have friendly media organizations that toe their line, and I think the opportunity here is that unusually enough, the Marcos administration seemed to have put an emphasis on addressing disinformation. And while this is kind of funny for me, this is something that needs to be picked up and followed through. That if this government is bent on addressing disinformation, then critical sectors in civil society, in the academia and media, should follow through on this.
Anyone else want to take a bite on that one? Ray, you just unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna. Well, I recently put a blog post up about this on CLight.live because I actually was personally accused by one of these pundits of essentially being the mastermind behind everything that's happened between the U.S. and the Philippines and China in the last year. And I wish I was that good. But I think that's to say, on one hand, you know, of course, these things happen. On the other hand, I'm not sure that a lot of these operations are very good. I don't think that China has shown itself to be very adept at some of these narrative warfare kinds of things. Now, not to say they're not making an impact, but I think a lot of what they've been doing has been actually digging themselves a deeper hole. And some of that is simply because the Chinese system has seized up a bit with regard to being able to be flexible. It's so tied up in putting out party line kinds of statements that it's lost a lot of its imagination and its innovation in messaging. So even though I'm disturbed and I don't like to see my picture behind the deputy chief of mission in Manila when he appears at a forum and talks about American influence, I'm not sure that it's having that huge an effect. I'll turn it over to my colleagues to tell me whether they think I'm right about that.
Yep, go ahead, Renato.
I have no answer regarding this, but I'll just address this question in terms of the experience. During the 6 years of the Duterte administration, I was part of a think tank that was practically going against the wave. The narrative, the fake news, the pro-China narrative is coming no less from the president himself. So this was really a tough challenge. But nevertheless, despite President Duterte's effort to basically sell China, based on the surveys conducted by the social weather stations and, of course, Pulse Asia, the Filipinos in general has a low trust rating vis-a-vis China, still the United States. That's, of course, the most trusted country. But I will not stop here. Of course, at this point in time, at least, the government is, had to defend the alliance. It had no choice. It has made a decision. So it's up to us individual academics like me, Aris, Jay Batumbakal, to basically try to pick up the cudgel and basically expose and oppose this pro-Chinese narrative. That the fact that what they're basically saying is simply Chinese propaganda line that is not even assessed nor critically examined. And of course, we would oppose it. The fact that we have our own views as academics, as Filipino citizens. So we will engage them head on in a dynamic discourse. As Aris said, we could not prevent them from, like, we're not China. The Philippines is still a liberal democracy. It's not an authoritarian or totalitarian regime where information, of course, is monopolized by a single party. So this is a challenge, and, we're up to it. Right, Aris? When the going gets tough, the tough gets going. That's what they say.
Yep, we'll try our best. We'll try our best.
Yeah.
You're amongst good company. Both Jeffrey Ordaniel, who of course, is our maritime director and organized this discussion. He's been recently targeted, and I was targeted after writing for the Telegraph newspaper about the fact that many Americans were no longer being allowed out of China, and so I said I'm not going to China. Boy, I got like 200, really fiery pundits. So I think we're all in for it. But maybe, as someone said, it's a badge of honor if you start to get targeted by the propagandists. So with that, we do have someone with their hand up, and I'm always happy to have people who are brave enough to put their hand up and come online. Kurt Abalos, sir, if you could come up and ask your question and perhaps indicate who you'd like to answer.
Hello.
Hello, we can hear you.
Okay. So good morning, afternoon, evening. My name is Kurt Abalos. I'm a MA student in Taiwan at the moment. One question, although I understand that it might be out of the scope of this discussion, I do want to raise the point of ASEAN's role, because unlike back then, Philippines used to be alone in the Cold War until the arrival of ASEAN. And today, ASEAN has become an important player nowadays in the region. And it's very underrated for it not to be highlighted in this entire situation. So my question is there still any prospect or hope for the US to support ASEAN centrality? In my research, I've seen that the European Union has claimed support for ASEAN centrality by issuing statements, conducting programs that increase the capacity building of different militaries around ASEAN. And it's worth noting of what the US has.
Question, you've actually already asked a two-part question. If you don't mind me cutting you off,
No
I think do you mind if I throw your first two questions at our panelist? So
no problem.
Thank you for that. The first question, my dear panelist, is essentially, what's the role for ASEAN? And the second question, I think, is a little bit aimed at our Americans, which is, does the US support ASEAN centrality in the way that it should? So Thank you, Kurt. Panelists, would someone like to take a bite at that first one? What's the role for ASEAN vis-a-vis the Philippines?
Right. I think from the Philippine side, it was critical in 2011 that we thought that ASEAN would support the Philippines on a stronger South China Sea position. But remember, that was the also year wherein ASEAN polarization was revealed, and the division within ASEAN became full-fledged. That was the only year that there was no statement from the ASEAN summit because of this. And what we perceived is that since then, the Philippines, I won't say has been lukewarm on ASEAN. It still values ASEAN, definitely. And all administrations have been consistent on this. But it also gives the signal that the Philippines cannot put all its eggs in the ASEAN basket, and that ASEAN must find its groove back in being able to be a convening forum for strategic issues in the region. As we speak, I think this week will be there will be an ASEAN meeting as far as the code of conduct is concerned. A lot of us observers have become skeptical of the code of conduct. But it doesn't mean that ASEAN will totally lose value. I think what's also important is for the United States to also see the value of ASEAN and ASEAN centrality. And I do hope that President Biden will still make an effort to attend the ASEAN summit, because commitment means showing up at the very least.
Christa,
Yeah, just to add on, I mean, I think the U.S. side is a mirror image of what Aris just said for the Philippine position. I mean, ASEAN matters. ASEAN centrality is a very important norm and way that ASEAN has operated for years. And the Philippines knows this, and the U.S. knows this. And the U.S. really does respect that centrality notion. At the same time, though, there are limits to what ASEAN can do, because it is just simply because of collective action problems. And as Aris mentioned, the 2011 issue, when Cambodia blocked the issue, and there have been others since then. And the fact that the code of conduct is still not decided is one very simple example of this. And I think ASEAN is very useful in many regional organizations, and all international organizations, honestly, are very good at some things. They can't be good at everything. And I think ASEAN does a very good job with many, many other issues that are necessary in that region for Southeast Asia. The South China Sea and this, larger dispute with China that's a much larger issue to deal with that ASEAN just should not have to handle on its own. Yeah, even though it is this idea of centrality and all agreeing, it's just not going to happen. And these, different member countries have different relationships with China and different disputes. Some countries, Cambodia doesn't have a dispute in the South China Sea. The Philippines does. So they have to have different positions just by default.
Yeah, and I just throw in that, I think we oftentimes, if you remember I think it was Singapore's ambassador to ASEAN back in 2015, who basically said, look, ASEAN, some people are trying to make ASEAN into a horse. It's not a horse, it's a cow. But oftentimes we try to ride the cow in the Kentucky Derby, and we're shocked that it doesn't win. So I think, when we ask about ASEAN centrality, I think we fail to ask the next question is central to what? So we don't want to try to make it central to everything, because that's just beyond its capabilities, as Christa said.
I may, as a moderator, but I'm also a researcher, intervene slightly in this one, because the U.S., the Camp David statement between South Korea, Japan, and the United States mentions ASEAN centrality. And of course, the Indo-Pacific strategies, the most recent 2021 Indo-Pacific strategy also mentioned it. I contest the concept, though, because the Quad, AUKUS, and many of the things that challenge ASEAN centrality are actually, they operate in the Indo-Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, they operate in the Pacific Islands and Northeast Asia. And I don't think ASEAN really wants to be central everywhere. It doesn't want to be central on the Korean Peninsula. It doesn't want to be, centrality in the Taiwan Strait for sure. And it certainly doesn't want to be central in the Pacific Islands. So I do think the concept is problematically expanded to mean everything that exists might challenge it. and I don't think it's really well defined in that sense. We do have more questions, but we're rapidly approaching the half-hour time. So there's a question from Leslie Wilhelm in his recent article for the Maritime Counterinsurgency Project in the August issue of the U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings. Retired Vice Commander of the Philippine Navy, Rear Admiral Rommel Ong, referenced the Sulu Sea patrol between Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines as a potential mini-lateral coalition that could serve as a model for a similar grouping of Southeast Asian countries to push it back against Chinese maritime insurgency. What are your thoughts? Are we, given that we've just mentioned ASEAN, but maybe sub-ASEAN, is there potential for mini-laterals within the ASEAN, particularly those states that have a maritime borders or interests? Renato, do you want to start with that?
That's also an idea raised by Associate Justice Carpio, especially in terms of the South China Sea dispute, that at least you have the maritime Southeast Asian countries, like, for example, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines would have a sort of understanding, resolve their respective disputes in the South China Sea, and basically, of course, have an understanding and try to deal with China in a collective manner. So there's a potential for this, so what we call a minilateral within ASEAN. But I think the best person who could answer that question is no less than Admiral Ong, who wrote that article. But of course, you also have to understand the nitty-gritty of that arrangement. It's far from perfect. I'm more or less familiar with that arrangement. It's really far from being perfect in terms of the joint patrol being conducted by the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia in that part of the world. It's still, in a way, a reflection of ASEAN, the lack of cohesion within ASEAN. It's not really a joint patrol. It's just at a certain point in time, the navies would meet at a certain point and conduct a joint patrol. But actually, it's more of a parallel patrol rather than a joint patrol. But that's, of course, a possibility that being raised by Admiral Rommel Ong, that ASEAN indeed could cooperate, but of course, you have to understand the nature of ASEAN cooperation. Okay, I stop here. I think Aris will have additional input because he's the ASEAN guy. I'm not.
Well, the idea behind this joint patrol between Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines back then was because of the Marawi siege. So basically, to reinforce what Renato said, the lines of engagement and responsibility and the terms are very clear. So in any case, retired Admiral Ong's advice to use this again will depend on willingness and capability. That willingness is often defined by a more well-defined rather than a broader sense. Oh, let's just do joint patrols. Against what? What's the division of labor? How long? What's the period? All of these devil in the detail questions are critical because unlike other minilaterals, an ASEAN minilateral might be more into the details rather than just, let's just group together. Mutuality of interest will define everything for us. That's not the way ASEAN works, as far as I'm concerned.
Christy and Ray, did you want to take a gander at either of those? If not, I'll move to the next question. No. Okay. We have some really great questions here. Another couple that I might push together a little bit. One is on the upcoming joint patrol between the United States and Philippines. Do you have insights as to whether those will be gray-hulled or white-hulled ships? And if gray-hulled, will that trigger China to send PLAN ships in disputed waters, even though PLAN, by the way, People's Liberation Army Navy, have already been active on surveillance pictures and satellite feeds? So that's quite a sort of predictive question. Ray, that seems like something that might be in your wheelhouse.
Well, I think mostly we're going to be looking at gray hulls because there are just a lot more of them. Our Coast Guard is a great service, but they don't have a lot of ships to send overseas. It's hard for them to be in all the different places they're in demand. So I would expect them to be great holes. As you mentioned, there are already Chinese great holes in all over the South China Sea, to include the West Philippine Sea. So now, would they consider that to be provocative? Well, yes, but do they consider almost everything to be provocative? Yes. And by the way, provocation and deterrence are simply two sides of the same coin, right? So in fact, I've said this before, actually sitting right next to Renato at a different function. Every deterrent will be framed as a provocation. So if you want to get into deterrence, it will be framed as a provocation. You just have to be ready for it. But that's not to say you shouldn't do deterrence, because in the end, that is how you hold off this marching dragon through your West Philippine Sea.
We're at 5:20. Did Aris or Renato or Christa, did you want to take a go at the gray holes, white holes question? If not, I'll move to the final question, which I was going to ask all of you. No one? Okay. So I think this last question is perhaps the most fun, because this was David J. He's asked sort of a predictive, how will the Philippines respond to an apparent, continued blockade, essentially, is the question. I'd like to turn that. I normally don't like asking the same question to everyone, because it just, you barely get through any questions. But this is quite a good one, because I ask all of you to think through, your analysis of how would the United States respond, how would China respond, what would the Philippines respond in the context of its domestic politics, and in the context of the wider countries in the region plus ASEAN. So let's go in the order that you all spoke. So that'd be Renato, then Christa, then Aris.
So responding to Ayungin blockade. So this is not new. I still remember in 2015 when I was with the National Security Council, the National Security Advisor, then General Garcia, asked me the same question. I look back in time and I look at what happened in the Quemoy Matsu. So this is, of course, a very dramatic when, of course, push comes to shove. The issue here, of course, is that China always have the escalation initiative. It happened on mischief-free. Probably the Philippines, and of course, with the support of the United States, will take the escalation initiative. And what happened at Quemoy Matsu, President Eisenhower ordered, Taiwanese landing ship tanks to be escorted by American destroyers. Let's see if it could happen in the 21st century. Just like Ray said, deterrence and provocation is basically two sides of the same coin. The Chinese has basically provoked us several times. Everything that we do, the Chinese always consider as provocation. Why not just, do something that, the Chinese have been doing to the Philippines since 1996? Of course, this is a political decision that will, of course, have to be made by no less than President Ferdinand Marcos Jr.
Christa, the tipping point.
I'll let Aris address the issue of the Senate and the Philippine, domestic politics, because that's a big part of this, obviously. But I think this gets again to on the point of on both sides, the question of, is this going to be provocative enough? And up to this point, both countries have been very cautious still. And yes, we want to deter, as Ray talks about, but there's still this constant fear. Is that going to be a provocative move? China's already being aggressive. They're already being. I'm not sure what more they could do except use live fire. And I think that's something that both countries really have to think about. And so, yes, if the Philippines decides to build a more permanent structure, whether it's a lighthouse or whatever, like they did in the Senkaku Islands, Japan did, I think this is a decision that obviously takes a lot of thought, but we've been thinking about this and thinking about it, and China just keeps going and going and going, and we keep on both sides keep sitting here watching China do it and say, should we respond? This is a critical time. The Philippines cannot let go of the shoal. It just can't, because it is a tipping point.
Aris?
I think we're seeing that China is also has some semblance of already blinking on this, because in one public forum, the Chinese embassy in Manila has said that they're willing to negotiate, or they're willing to talk with its issues, because and this is this is why it's important that countries rally around the idea, not to rally just around the Philippines, but rally around the idea that on the principle of the peaceful settlement of disputes. And to double down on this, we've seen embassies, major embassies in Manila, issuing statements immediately after the Ayungin Shoal incident. Just a special mention, South Korea embassy in Manila for the first time came out with a statement condemning the aggression of China and in Ayungin Shoal. So I think while China might think that it can do what it wants, even major powers, even superpowers could be made vulnerable, and this is why it's important that this policy of transparency is there, full disclosure on what is happening in real time, so that reactions to this and unfortunate incidents that could cause major conflict will be avoided.
I think that's remarkable. You mentioned that South Korea embassy made that statement. That's very unusual, and it shows you how different countries traveled on their own paths and their own journeys to get to where they are. Ray.
Let me just say, if I speak from my fears, my fear would be that what the Philippines would conclude is that they can continue on the same trajectory, and that would essentially not, figure out what do we do to break or circumvent or lift the blockade. I think that this is an excellent time to talk about this as a strategic opportunity. With all of the world watching, with the resilience that you've built up among the Filipino nation, this is a great time to figure out how do we use this leverage to come to a permanent solution, because the permanent solution that China has in mind is for the ship to break up. And at that point, again, you'll be out of options. You'll lose all of your leverage. So I think that, Christa mentioned a civilian structure, a lighthouse, that Justice Carpio has advocated for this. I think that may be a position that you could go to China with, essentially, and say, let's, if you want to compromise. Obviously, the Sierra Madre is not bringing combat power to where it is. It is a symbolic entity. And so if you wanted to go out and say, look, we're going to put up a civilian structure, we've got our U.S. ally behind us, we're going to do it on this date, please don't interfere. We want to do this so that we can put this whole thing behind us and remove this as a source of aggravation between the two countries. And I think, again, this may be the window of strategic opportunity for that.
All right. I want to thank a number of people. First of all, those of you who came up on screen and asked your questions, you braved the virtual screen. Thank you very much, James, Donald, and Kurt, for asking those wonderful questions, very provocative questions. I also want to thank Carol Lee and Megan Tanaka, who are behind the camera today, who have been helping us with this event taking place. If you see me looking to the side, it's because I'm getting information from them on my screen, my other screen on my desktop, so I can stay current with all of you. A very big thanks to Dr. Jeffrey O'Daniel, who, of course, has organized this, who is our Maritime Director here at Pacific Forum, very able and very knowledgeable on all these issues. And finally, a big thanks to the audience for coming, for tuning in, for taking part, but especially to you panelists. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask everyone in the virtual if you can touch your clap button there, and then thank you very much for taking part, Ray, Christa, Renato, and Aris. You guys were really great. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming along.